Index funds are probably one of the best creations for investors in the last 50 years, but even with decades of history, I think there's so much out there that people don't understand. So here's my take on 8 things about index funds that everyone needs to know, and some things that many people just get wrong. Up first, index funds are not all the same. Now, this is probably one of the most confusing things when you're a new investor, because you'll hear everyone talk about index funds all the time and just assume that it's really easy to find them and invest in them. And while they are simple, there are so many of them now, and that I can easily see why many people get confused. You see, the word index fund can describe so many different options. It's almost like saying, well, I've got an iPhone or an iPad. They might all be called the same, but there's so many different versions and sizes. So for example, there's an index that covers pretty much every area of the investing market. But just remember that all an index is a list of things, and that list of things can be any kind of category. Just like you can have a list of iPhones, Premier League football teams, or even chocolate bars. Now, some indexes can be really general and others can be really specific, and this is where it can get confusing for people. In the investing world, you might have heard of the S&P 500, which is an index of the biggest companies in the US, including Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, and all of the rest. This index, the S&P 500, was actually one of the first kinds of index funds that you could buy when they were first created. But since then, they've grown massively, and now you have everything from global index funds to index funds that cover just stocks in the electric car market, or even AI stocks. So the lesson here is just to be careful when you're out looking for the right index fund to invest in, and make sure that you first check what kind of index that fund is actually trying to track in the first place. It's a tricky subject and there's lots more details to go through, but it actually leads us nicely onto point number 2, and that is index funds can be bought in different ways. I actually get this question a lot, and people will send me 2 different links and say, what's the difference between these two? And often the biggest difference is just that one might be an ETF and one might be a mutual fund. So what does that mean? Well, just like you can buy something from Amazon, you can also buy the same thing at 100 different places. And sometimes you can even pay monthly for something, or maybe you can pay it off in one go. Now, index funds can also be bought from lots of providers and come in lots of different shapes and sizes, with the biggest differences being an ETF or a mutual fund. So an ETF, or exchange traded fund, is a really popular way to invest in an index fund, and the main benefit is that ETFs are bought and sold on the stock market. A popular example from both here in the UK and over in the States would be something like VWRL here in the UK and SPY over in the States. Now, these are both ETFs. You can buy them in any decent investing app. One is global and one is just for the S&P 500. Now, throughout the day, their price changes just like a stock does, and they typically have very low fees. Now, mutual funds, on the other hand, are not traded on the stock market. They're only priced once per day, and you can only buy them on certain investing platforms. Also, but not always, they do tend to be slightly more expensive than ETFs, but always do check that before you invest. There's lots of mutual funds which invest in exactly the same things as those ETFs that we just mentioned, and many mutual funds are classed as index funds in exactly the same way as ETFs. But, and this is the biggest but, not every ETF or mutual fund is an index fund. Just another thing to be careful of. In fact, there are tens of thousands of different ETFs and mutual funds, but don't worry. If you're looking for some help, I do have lots of good videos on my channel dedicated to helping you find them, and I'll leave a link in the description below that you can check out after this one. Now, on to point 3, there is more than one provider of indexes. I know, as if you thought investing wasn't complicated enough, and now you find out that there isn't just one single index that we all agree on. Anyway, mostly this doesn't really matter, but it can be important if you're trying to work out the difference between a selection of funds. So step back for a second and let's see how this all works. So there's companies like MSCI, FTSE Russell, and S&P Global who create and maintain indexes. So for example, the world famous S&P 500 is an index collected and managed by the company S&P Global. And then here in the UK, the company FTSE Russell collects and manages indexes like the FTSE 100 and the FTSE 250. Now, once you have these indexes made, you then have other companies who license that index and create their own investment fund based around it. So what you end up with, as an example, is something like Vanguard's S&P 500 Index Fund. This would be managed by Vanguard, but they're using the S&P 500 license. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. And as you'll probably see, loads of companies have S&P 500 index funds. So you'll see ones from iShares by BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard, and of course many others. Now, that's an easy one because they're all the same. However, here's where the difference is. MSCI and FTSE Russell, 2 major index fund managers, actually put different countries around the world into different categories. So Let's say that you want to buy an index fund that covers most of the developed world and maybe some emerging markets as well. You might assume that all of the funds out there are the same. Now, unfortunately, you'd be wrong. So MSCI and FTSE Russell see the world slightly differently, with one of the biggest differences being how they class each country. Now, the biggest difference, as you can see here, is that MSCI counts South Korea as an emerging country, whereas FTSE Russell counts it as a developed one. Now, sounds like something that isn't worth considering, but then this does change how your money would be invested, as you can see on screen now, just slightly. Then secondly, FTSE's global index includes a lot more of the smaller companies that get missed out by MSCI. Now, whether this is a good or a bad thing in terms of your investment returns, there's no way of knowing, but I do think it's worth at least knowing about and being aware of. And as you can see on screen now, here's how many companies are in each company's index currently. So no need to get too stressed out about this one, but do be aware if you see one global index fund by MSCI and another one by FTSE, what the differences are, other than the ongoing fees. What a fun fact that was. Anyway, you'll probably end up winning a pub quiz sometime in maybe a few years with that level of knowledge. Okay, next up, sorry, I've got to say this, but index funds will not beat the market. Now this sounds obvious, and I know many people will think, what is this guy on about? But just bear with me because it really ties in nicely onto the next point as well. Let's take the S&P 500 and say we're invested into an index fund that covers it. As an investor, we will get back whatever the market gives us, but then we also need to remember to remove any fees. Remember, that's all an index fund can give us, whatever the market returns minus fees. Now, sometimes those returns might be good and sometimes those returns might be negative and we might lose money. But either way, all we are guaranteed to get is the return of the market, nothing more, nothing less, apart from the fees, of course, and that lowers that returns. If all we do is invest into index funds, we do need to accept that we aren't going to have any crazy years where we make 100% or something like that, unless the market happens to do that. Now, I'm not saying this as a negative thing, it's just an observation and something that you have to accept, and it will take a lot of patience over many, many years to be able to really compound your money. But what we do know from history at least is that if you can stick with an index fund, maybe something like the S&P 500 or even a global one, you'll do probably pretty well if you keep investing no matter what. On the plus side, when you do invest into an index fund, you do get the protection of the market as well. So while some stock pickers might lose all of their money or most of it, there's no way that you can go to zero unless the whole world goes boom. But to be honest, by that point, you should be well in your bunker by then, trying to work out how many cans of baked beans you have left and who's going to get the last fresh tomato. Okay, linking nicely from the last point, apocalypse to one side for a second, index funds will beat most investors, even if they don't beat the market. Now this point is super important because it doesn't matter if we're talking about professional money managers or even experienced retail investors. Over the long term, index funds just keep winning. Let me show you some really interesting evidence to prove this point. On screen now, here's a report by JP Morgan showing the returns of different areas of the market over 20 years up to 2021. Now, as you can see, this green bar shows us that the S&P 500 provided investors with a return of 9.5% per year over that period, which is really nice. However, this doesn't mean that investors actually got anywhere close to that because unfortunately, most people have no idea what they're doing. They try to buy and sell stocks and get caught up in all of the hype. 3.6% is all that was achieved by the average retail investor during that period, and they only just beat the average rate of inflation. You almost have to look twice here because that number is just so bad. Now, I'm no professional advisor, but come on, seriously, if you don't have index funds as a large part of your investing portfolio, then you really are putting your financial future at risk, in my view. Even setting aside retail investors just for a moment, what about the so-called professionals who are meant to be good at investing? Well, according to the latest report from S&P Global, who track the long-term performance of all of the different investment funds out there, across the last 15 years, just 7.81% of funds have managed to beat the S&P 500. Remember that there are literally thousands of funds, so that's just a few out there who beat the market, and I'd put a strong bet on that you or I will not be the ones to find the winning ones and time it right. I think it's probably a good time to mention that if you do want to get started investing, I always keep the links to my favorite platforms in the description. So go ahead, get yourself some free shares and some free money to get started when you sign up. It also helps support the channel too, and thank you to the many hundreds of people who have taken advantage of those offers already. Check them out below. Next up, as much as I bang on about index funds, and some of you might be sick of them by now, seriously, we are still so early in this space because index funds are still unknown to most people, let alone most investors. Remember that index funds have only been around since the 1970s, and even then, they've only really got more popular recently over the past couple of decades. But even with the trillions of dollars now invested in passive market, which includes index funds, there's still more outside of them and loads of money invested into stupidly overcomplicated and expensive funds. I was talking to someone recently I had a one-to-one with, and we were looking at what they had been investing in currently, and their current investing fund was costing them more than 2% a year in fees and even had a 5% charge just to get in. Just compare that for a second to a global index fund with no charge to get in and ongoing costs of around 0.2% a year. The amount of money that you can save over the years with an index fund is huge, and don't forget that even if the stock market crashes, your expensive fund that is meant to be really good is still going to go down too, but you'll still be paying those high fees every single year, guaranteed. Honestly, we're still so far away from index funds being oversaturated or really popular. You only have to look at what most retail investors are buying to come to that conclusion. And unfortunately, a lot of that comes down to human nature, with most people wanting to get rich quick or really just not knowing what they're doing. Index funds are just getting started, so you're definitely not too late to jump on board. Now, here's the next point. If you're an investor who loves dividend stocks, or maybe you're an investor who only buys fast-growing tech stocks, index funds have all of these stocks in them. You own everything. And say you own the S&P 500, for example, you'll own Tesla, you'll own Apple, but you'll also own Coca-Cola, American Express, and all of the rest. No matter what type of stock it is, you'll own it, and you'll also get paid the dividends as well. You don't have to pick and choose and try and figure out if a stock is worth buying, still growing, or going to do well over the next few years. You'll just own them all. Now, John Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, who played a key role in the creation of the index fund, said that it's better to own the whole haystack than trying to find the needle in the haystack. I actually did a video recently focusing on dividend stocks and looking at the dividend snowball, which a lot of investors seem to love the idea of. But then when you look at just how few stocks match the performance of the S&P 500 or beat it, you realize that it's such a small number, you really have to ask yourself the question if you're somehow special and you're going to find the 3% of stocks that have matched or beaten the performance of the S&P 500 over the last 10 years, including those that pay a dividend. Personally, I'd rather have a bit more humility, admit that there's no way of knowing that, and just own everything. But even after saying all of that, you don't have to just invest in index funds, and you can still invest in whatever else you want outside of them. It's not like it's your only choice. You can still have some stock picks or put some money into a company you believe in. But I just like to keep that for a smaller part of my investments because I need to realize that in the long run, there's a good chance I won't pick the right one. So I keep index funds as the majority of my investments, and I also share most of them here on YouTube, which you can watch after this video. Now, the final point, index funds already do everything for you. So what I mean here is that let's say you have a global index fund and you own pretty much the whole world's stock market according to market cap weight. Just a fancy way of saying the bigger the company, the more of your money's invested. As the market changes and companies move up and down, and some change from small companies to massive ones over the years, your investments will change to reflect that. If you had to manage your own investments and your own portfolio, you could end up with a situation where 50% of your money is in one company that's suddenly blown up in price. And while you might be fine with that, that could also be a risk that you'd rather not have to worry about. Index funds remove all the complicated choices that you have to make as an investor, and it's almost like a free balancing service built in for a super low cost. For me, I think that's priceless because the issue you get when you start investing is that it's so tempting to start creating this really complicated portfolio with some stocks here, some ETFs over here, and before you know it, you've created a Frankenstein portfolio which is a complete mess. I know because I've been there and done that. Now, thankfully, I got rid of the monster and I made my investing a lot simpler over the last few years, and it's really all thanks to index funds. So if you're starting to spend a long time worrying about your investments, or you really can't be bothered looking at financial statements anymore, or trying to keep up with the news, index funds are the answer. I mean, to be honest, don't we already have enough to worry about in real life? And on that note, if you're looking to invest in index funds and you're not sure where to start, here's a video where I look at the S&P 500 compared to the whole world and ask the important question, which one should you choose? You might be surprised by the answer. I'll see you in the next video. Happy investing.